Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support. I'm so excited and honoured to have with me today Charles Partee. Charles Partee is the P.C. Rossin Professor of Church History at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, author of the seminal book, The Theology of John Calvin, which I have with me here. And it's a real honour and a privilege to have you with us, Charles. To get us going, could you maybe go back to the beginning and tell us how your interest in sort of Calvin started?
Yes, certainly. I grew up in the sovereign state of Arkansas, which is not very academic. It's an agricultural state. But I had an interest in books. We didn't have television when I was a child. We didn't have smartphones. And so in order to escape where we were living, we would read books. And at some point, a pastor in a nearby congregation asked me what I would do, what I would major in college. And I hadn't thought that I would major in anything at all. And so I suggested the only teacher I admired was the English literature teacher. So I said, I think it'll probably be English literature. And he said to me, no, you can't major in English literature. You're a philosopher. And I didn't know what a philosopher was. In my little town, the Yellow Pages did not contain a category of philosophers, so I had to look it up. And I was sure that in my 30 boy and girl class, there was no philosopher. So another pastor told me that I should read Plato's Dialogues at age 14, which I began to do, and John Calvin's Institutes. And so that was the start. And as I went on, I had the books, I had bought the books, and I had read them. I didn't understand them. I didn't get the grammar of either of those massive and magnificent texts, but that's how it got started. The other little piece of reading was that in my small town, there were only 3 really pretty girls in my age range, and none of them were interested in me. And so the only thing I could do is read books and get involved in athletics, which I happily did. And then I went off to graduate school, thinking that I would work in philosophical theology. And my thought would be that if my German was good enough, I would write on Karl Barth and his concept of reason with my philosophical interest. But I decided my German was not good enough. And my major professor left to go back to Oxford. And so I was without a major professor and shifted then to the history of doctrine, and that made John Calvin and the philosophers. And my first book was Calvin and Classical Philosophy. And so that came out very early and was, of course, as you know, under the jurisdiction and supervision of a major professor who wanted the book written his way, not my way. The second Calvin book I wrote my way and tried to put in humorous footnotes and a couple of other things. There is one sentence with 4 of Charles Dickens' titles describing the Eucharist that I'm assuming nobody caught. But it talks about Bleak House and hard times and the Pickwickian meaning and so on. So it's been fun. And I moved into Calvin studies with what I thought were my strength, which is philosophy, first of all, and then an entire summary, which is not really an attempt to explain Calvin as though I knew what he thought, but an engagement, that is my engagement with Calvin, suggesting that it might be interesting for other people.
Thank you so much. Yes, I've got your other work here, Calvin and Classical Philosophy. I imagine in popular perception, a lot of people think Calvin's very negative about reason. How do you see it?
Well, there are any number of places where he both praises reason and where he objects to reason. And I had rather thought that scholars would look at what in my last book is the excursus, which tries to deal with epistemology and with what Calvin thought, which of course is a very serious problem. One little footnote is that what I believe I have done, and you are starting to do, is to work on paradigm theology. By that, I mean we are dealing with orthodoxy from a distant past. And I would claim now, at the end of my career, that we have missed the point. That as a matter of fact, the church is not serving its intellectual congregants because we are simply not available to discuss what I believe to be the major threat to Christian understanding, which is Immanuel Kant in the philosophical dimension. And his critique of reason is absolutely devastating. I don't know a handful of ministers who have read his Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. And if he's right, then we're wrong. And to exercise the paradigm is not nearly as helpful to go back into the past and talk about conscience as Calvin defined it 500 years ago, when we have Immanuel Kant as well as Sigmund Freud. And worst of all, according to Emil Brunner, the church has never properly dealt with Charles Darwin. And we're now in a negative position in terms of intellectual acumen dealing with our culture, which is humanistic, mechanical. The spiritual is disappearing from all of our culture, including my own, and very likely everybody else's. We are risen animals, not the fallen angels that Plato thought. But nonetheless, my whole life was to do theology based on thinking with John Calvin 500 years ago with the topics that he wanted to treat, which are not the main ones now. So if I were to do it again, I would try to deal with John Hick and the people who take Immanuel Kant and his critique of reason very seriously, and who are very much aware that Charles Darwin explains our tribalism in a way that we keep saying correctly, of course, is that we should love our enemies, but it's an uphill battle for us in the church nowadays, I think.
Yeah, so interesting. For our listeners who might not be familiar with Immanuel Kant's critique, he said basically that there was, and do correct me if I'm wrong on this, Charles, that there was this distinction between the phenomena and the noumena, which is things as they are in themselves and things as we perceive them. What he ended up doing, though, was putting God in the category of the noumena. So God is not an object of the empirical senses. And therefore, where does that leave you? If God's not an empirical object, then suddenly there's this, exactly as you were alluding to, this question mark over knowledge of any kind of knowledge of God. And yeah, as you say, Western Christianity has sort of been reeling in the wake of that critique ever since. Do you think Calvin has I realize he's writing significantly before and in a completely different milieu to Kant, but do you think he has some interesting things that could be retrieved?
Well, I think that's the major issue that the brain trust in the Christian church should be dealing with, because that's where we're losing the battle. Obviously, Christianity is not simply an intellectual matter. It's far more a matter of fellowship. It's a matter of community. It's a matter of loving one another. It's faith, hope, and love rather than goodness, beauty, and truth in trying to deal with those things. But that was not what I was taught. In my academic life, we were told that we should be reasonable. And I give that credit to the Puritans, who said that reason is the very voice of God. And the valorization of reason for most of us, assuming that we can convince people logically to be Christian rather than to recognize that it's far more complicated. It's more a matter of faith, but it's also a matter of love rather than of logical, cognitive conclusions. So what I think happens is that we need an entirely separate category to deal with modern threats to Christianity, including these. Again, Immanuel Kant in The Intellectual, I think he died around 1804, 1810, somewhere along in there. And we simply ignored him. Most theologians pretend he never lived and that his critique never applied to us. But my conclusion is that with a friend like Immanuel Kant, the Christian church doesn't need an enemy. We've got someone who thought he was Christian, who, as a matter of fact, destroyed the Christology of the church, which we cannot allow that to go, and make Christ an example rather than a savior. So that would be my problem if I started over. But I learned a lot from John Calvin, and it was, I don't think he's going to help us with reason or with emotion. And of course, we're living in a time where the newspapers talk about the rational revolution, and that we need to base our lives on something other than logic and so on. But I find it very comfortable. And one of my friends said of the last Calvin book that this is not really about Calvin, it's my own dogmatics. And so I am trying to say what I think Calvin might have responded 500 years later to problems that he didn't see in his day because they weren't there.
How would you engage? How would you respond to the perception of Calvin, in popular culture, that he's this kind of joyless, harsh disciplinarian?
Well, again, we read and see what we're prepared to see. And when I started this, I assumed that John Calvin was what I had learned from, or at least inferred from people who had mentioned the name. And of course, there's all kinds of criticisms of Calvin. And I think they mostly come from the development. And the big question is, does history develop Calvin or distort Calvin? And I come down on the side of distortion, because I think what has happened is that Calvin was interpreted by the canons of Dort, therefore the Dutch, and therefore very shortly after that, by the Westminster Confession. And so there is a Calvin who is the result of the canons of Dort, 1619, and the Westminster Confession, which is essentially Puritan in your country. And so that's the major interpretation of Calvin. I call that the conservative or the orthodox view. There is also a liberal view of Calvin. That's the interpretation of Calvin through Schleiermacher, which is an attempt to go around the end of the scrum, or whatever that is, and talk about Immanuel Kant in a very vague way. But that would be the Schleiermacher Calvin. And in recent days, about 30 years ago, there's a third category of Calvin scholars, which I call the evangelical Calvinist. And that would be the Calvinist who also read Karl Barth and Tom Torrance, who admire Calvin, but not for his use of reason, and not perfectly willing to discourage the idea that reason is the voice of God. In fact, Charles Darwin insisted that reason is simply an animal brain gotten more sophisticated, and therefore he sees no evidence for a soul or any kind of connection with a God, or in Kant's term, the noumenal world. We know it's there because of the moral imperative, but we don't know anything more about that. And that makes the scriptural comment, "Thus saith the Lord," really debatable for human beings who are risen animals, if that's all we are. And I think the church needs to counterattack that we are not just risen animals. We are in the image of God, but it's not just reason. It's that we can love and that we can devote ourselves to other people and to our planet and on and on.
Interesting. Your sort of position on Calvin has been described by Tony Lane as the no school approach, and you have argued quite persuasively, I think, that while there's no sort of mega concept running through Calvin, union with Christ is a very useful, I think the image he uses of a key that unlocks quite a few doors in the Institutes. Would you mind just saying a bit more about that for people who might not be familiar with that, who maybe just associate Calvin with predestination, how you came to discover that and how you understand union with Christ?
I've spent a very long time reading John Calvin, and as one reads, of course, as we've already agreed, you read with the eyes you have and with the categories that you're thinking about. And so the very first one is to assume that his major work, the Institutes, is divided along the lines of the Apostles' Creed, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and Church. My major professor, and this goes back a kind of line that I want to claim and not claim all at the same time. My major professor was a student of Emil Brunner, who was, of course, a friendly enemy of Karl Barth. And so my major advisor also had a division of the Institutes, which he called the knowledge of Creator and the knowledge of the Redeemer. So that's another way to organize the Institutes, which is the most famous of Calvin's work. And thinking about it, it seemed to me that what we all have to admit is that Calvin does have a group of pearls on a table. That's my other image. But he doesn't describe the string that holds the pearls together. And so he gives us doctrines that I find very helpful for preaching or understanding the scripture, not for dealing with Kant and Darwin and Schleiermacher and other people that I don't want to deal with. But I wanted to claim that one possibility, it's not for sure, it's not the central doctrine, though a number of scholars have assumed that's what I meant, that it was in fact a central doctrine. It is one way, I claim, to approach what might be the string. Calvin doesn't tell us it's the string. He doesn't tell us there is a string. He just tells us what he believes the proper confession 500 years ago would look like. And I find that extremely helpful as a paradigm. And then the question is, how do you deal with the other questions that come up about the Christian faith in the modern time? So it seemed to me, and this isn't entirely new either, way back in the 30s, Karl Barth and Tom Torrance were arguing about union with Christ, about the communion with Christ, and so on, as the great mystery. And if you substitute mystery for reason, then you've got a whole new theology. And it seems to me that there is enough connections with every doctrine to this mystery of our union with Christ. And I would think that is more the gospel than to say in a pulpit, come friends, let us reason together. I think we simply talk about this great mystery, this glorious mystery that we don't understand. We have no way of understanding, but the scripture talks all the time about union with Christ, the body of Christ, which we are members, and so on and on. I think we've missed the central gospel on that particular emphasis that would really be helpful to congregations, which is what pastors deal with more than the academics. The academics are all on one side, and it seems to me that would be very helpful. And so it seems to me that we would do across all the theological categories is to start trying to believe somehow or other that in him we live and move and are. And I take very seriously with Karl Barth, what is it, Colossians 3:3, that we have died and our life is hid with Christ in God. You can't scare somebody who really believes that. And that would make the Christian church, while a smaller group, it would certainly make the Christian church braver, and we would think better of ourselves to realize that we were working upstream in a culture that's moving in the other direction, something to be proud of, I think, rather than to be ashamed of.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what you were saying there about mystery with Calvin, that he has I know what you mean. He has a way of phrasing things which deploys mystery unashamedly, but not in such a way as to retreat behind it in a way that secular people might raise an eyebrow at. He doesn't bifurcate knowledge and experience. They're sort of interwoven in a very rich way in his thinking, and that's certainly why I found him generative. And I was surprised to see that Schleiermacher actually liked Calvin, because he said that Calvin's institutes never lose touch with the religious affections. I think there's probably something in that. I don't know. I don't think that quite solves the issue of getting past the Kant critique, as you say.
It seems to me that that would be a paradigm shift. That would be a revolutionary theology to put love or faith in the place that we now have reason and logic. And I think it would be far more persuasive. The politicians have showed us that sincerity and loud talk is more persuasive than careful reflection and syllogistic logic. That's not who we're historical people as opposed to logical people. We just, I don't know anyone who has been convinced by reason. It looks like reason sometimes, and there are people out there who will give you reasons, but the poet says, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." But you're not counting all the ways. You're counting a number of them, a number of important ways. But finally, love is so much larger. And I think faith is so much larger. And we should celebrate the strength and mystery as opposed to trying to convince people that if they just thought better, there would be more people in church on Sunday. That's just not the case. We come for fellowship. We come because we want to see our friends, and we want to hear the good news that life is worth living.
Yeah, totally. Are there any things in particular where you more strongly disagree with Calvin? Obviously, we're clear on some of the areas where you agree with him and where you find him to be generative. I think I liked what you said about his doctrine of sanctification. It glitters with purest ray serene. I agree with you on that. I'm slightly biased because that's the focus of my PhD, is his doctrine of sanctification, but I do agree it's a particularly beautiful part of his theology. But are there any areas of him or his approach that you might disagree with or you're a bit unsure about?
I think there are a number of places that, while he is working admirably within a paradigm, is not helpful for anyone in the 21st century. His view of reason is not adequate. His view of the Bible is not adequate. Too much has happened in biblical studies, and I think we can admire Calvin for his own time, and he's a brilliant, brilliant biblical commentator, but he didn't know what we know now about the historical critical method. He doesn't know about the humanity of the scripture and issues that didn't come up in his time. We could go on and on about those. I just see the major threat is this move toward mechanical interpretations, humanistic, animalistic interpretations of the human race, which is so powerful. You only go around once. The whole idea of a culture that would be attempt to be built on Christian principles of honesty and loyalty. There's so much to learn in there, but there's a great deal that we have changed in terms of the authorship of the various scriptural books, and for all Calvin's brilliance, Bible and philosophy are the two that I look most askance over 500 years and want to try to deal with what philosophers and biblical scholars are saying now, rather than simply to repeat and insist that Calvin is somehow correct in all these things. He is a magnificent help, but I think we have to encounter what we find in our lives and the lives of the people we're trying to help, and so on.
Yes, and he's one of those figures I find who, I don't know if you'd agree with this or not, but where it's very easy for people to either put him on a pedestal and say he's like, the next best thing after Jesus. And then there's people who absolutely hate him, and therefore getting a more nuanced picture of him, which you're alluding to there, which places him in his context and recognizes some of the limitations of what he was able to do in his time. It's very hard to do that well because of what a contested figure he is.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular hopes for where you would see Calvin's studies going in the future?
Well, for me, the dumbing down of Western industrial culture is a very sad thing, and we've seen it occur. We've seen at least when I was younger, not everybody wanted to be a scholar, but ordinary people admired scholarship in a way that I don't see that happening now. You almost have to apologize for reading materials in the humanities. For example, we don't have in the Protestant tradition, we don't have a divine comedy. I would like to see a Protestant poet write about the life after this life. We don't have any images to admire. And if you have lost, as nearly everyone has lost, a dear friend, a parent, a child, if we had images, I'm convinced we live by stories rather than by syllogisms, and that the parables and the stories of the scripture are crucial, and that's rather than rational calculations is what the church should be doing, telling the old story. And if we could figure as leaders in the church that that's what we should be doing, rather than trying to logically convince people to come and worship. You don't come and worship because you're logically convinced. You come because you have some emotional need. Then there are all kinds of intelligence, emotional, social intelligence, and so on. So I would think that would, I have the feeling that academic work is going to go into the universities, that the church is not going to support, that ordinary people in congregations really don't want to hear about Shakespeare or Dante or Milton. And if you refer to them, even the Bible now, you refer to those texts, you're not connecting with a lot of the people. They are connected with what they've seen on television or the sporting components of the culture. I don't see a future dawning for more serious academic theological work. And for some time now, theologian has tended to be a negative term, that it's an egghead. And in fact, in my first parish, when I was a pastor, one of the elders came and said, the Lord said, feed my sheep, not my giraffe. And I thought, well, the Lord didn't say feed my worms either. And so he was complaining that I was using words or concepts, and I was too young to know that I really needed to communicate with the people that were sitting in front of me rather than with the professors that I had just left at the academic places. And so over my lifetime, that's the way I have developed my own thought. And of course, now I use that as a justification not to be ashamed of what I've been able to do and what I'm not able to do.
Yeah. Have you found that easier to do as you've gone on in terms of translating your scholarship into language that people can get hold of and understand?
For me, the use of humor is a serious rhetorical component. And I had rather hoped that some of the footnotes in the Calvin book, the last Calvin book, the one I wrote for me rather than for a professor, because I think some of the footnotes are hilariously funny. And some people have noticed the references to literature, the literature I know, Mark Twain and his Green Conscience, for example. And I was hoping that scholars would lighten up a bit and enjoy doing what they were doing and let the reader every now and then have a little chuckle that something humorous could be said of something very serious. And so I have made a serious attempt to instill some kind of humor in every sermon. And that has worked out very well. I also try to smuggle in one line of Shakespeare somehow or other and put it in there so well that nobody notices that it's Shakespeare. And it's a bit smug to think that what I say and what Shakespeare says are the same or could be the same and not be noticed. And so it got to be a kind of a challenge with my Shakespeare friends in the congregation to see when I was going to use half a phrase in making another point and see if they could catch it. One sermon, I conflated Hamlet and Macbeth, and it really messed up the fellow who knew them both, but not together, because, of course, they didn't appear together. So I think part of what we need to do is not be so anxious about our future, because that, after all, is in God's hands. And one of my professors said, the church should get smaller as we get to the end rather than larger. But the American way, anyway, is get bigger, better, richer. That tells you're doing it proper way. That's not clearly the case. It may be the more faithful we are, the fewer we are.
It's interesting what you were saying about humor as well. I mean, how do you rate Calvin's humor?
Calvin was a very sick man most of his life. What did he die at 55 or something like that somewhere? He wrote one hilariously funny piece that probably nobody has read. It's an inventory that the church would enjoy with an inventory of relics. And he questions whether or not, I think I mentioned that in one of the footnotes, that Calvin himself has seen the milk of Mary in 4 different churches in the reliquary. And Calvin has a little snide comment to the effect that he wonders who collected the breast milk of the Virgin Mary. That's as close as he comes. And there are several other kind of zingers that are surprising. Benjamin Warfield has a chapter on Calvin's humor. It's a kind of a mordant humor. I don't think he felt well enough to just have a really humorous, just humor for humor's sake. But I think you slip things into people. I try a little blog with his humorous kinds of things. That life can be light too if you see it in that direction, and the confidence that our God is in command and that somehow it's all going to work out convinces me that that's the way we should think about evil. Calvin does not explain evil. He can't explain evil. And of course, the death of his son was a great tragedy for him and for his wife. But I think what he did teach us is that we can look forward to a better time coming and that we can have confidence in the future, even as we have to endure what we can't explain. That's probably the summary for me, is that I had been taught my whole life that the real ministry was to explain. And I think the real ministry is to endure with and to be with people who are suffering. And I learned in pastoral care that it doesn't matter what you say, you need to be there. And if you're comfortable and you can hold the hand of someone who's just lost a child and is weeping and so on, that you do better. I think Calvin understood that. I think he can teach us that if we listen, rather than to go as I did for years and years and years with the assumption that he was giving me the logical answer. And anybody who was intelligent would agree that John Calvin had it right. I think that's not the case. I think union with Christ is far more central than his concept of reason, which isn't spelled out anywhere, nor is his concept of experience, though you can see what he thought about pieces of that and so on. So it's always great. And all kinds of people have realized that he was just an instinctive genius with theological reflection, like Mozart was with notes on a page. You can't explain that finally, I think, except that there are gifted people that the rest of us can learn from and are better for knowing about. I think it's great to read Shakespeare over and over and over. I'm a big fan of Charles Dickens and so on. Not an admirer of his character, but nonetheless an admirer of his novels.
I'm actually not too far from Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford-upon-Avon. I'm about a 20-minute drive from there.
I found a rock in Stratford that Shakespeare had stepped on.
Oh, really?
And, people ask me how I know, and it's a revelation. It was just on the ground there when we were enjoying the times at Stratford, as well as the Globe. We saw all three Henrys in one day at the Globe in London.
All three? Wow.
All three. And Henry V was 100-pound female, which is a new move. Flexible gender is what it's called at the Globe.
Really? Wow. I wonder what the thinking was behind that.
Well, it's all over now. And we saw Taming of the Shrew. The Shrew was a man. And Petruchio was a female and about 2 feet shorter than the Shrew. So all very interesting for sure.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know as well, like with them, because obviously Shakespeare's impact on the English language is incalculable. And I imagine that I don't know the extent of Calvin's influence on the French language.
Well, the claim is that Calvin was a major influence on the French language. And the scholar who's done most of that work is Francis Higman. And he's dealt quite a bit with Calvin's language. And there's forgotten the guy's name who puts together Shakespeare and Rabelais and wants to claim that Calvin and Rabelais were the creators of the modern French language, and that the old style is our friend Guillaume Farel, who's using the more open, flowing style that Calvin gave up for a leaner type prose. But that's beyond me. I just take the word of people who know that better than I do.
Yeah, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in Calvin and Farrell's conversations. It sounds like they were. It sounds like they judged sort of towards the end that they were kind of not good for each other and tried to keep them separate because they sort of egged each other on in their reforming efforts in ways that that some of the authorities didn't like. But yeah, their friendship clearly remained really warm and close.
Yes. I remember Farel married a much younger woman, and Calvin objected. They didn't think that was seemly. But Yes, they were very good friends. And one of the interesting things for me that'll never happen is the use of the term substance in Eucharist. I don't think we know what we're talking about. And that was a huge debate. And it still resonates around the culture. But Calvin, as you know, insisted with Bullinger that the word substance had to be used in the Zurich Confession. And Bullinger didn't want to do that, but he ended up putting it in there. And I think it's a strange body. And I have decided, in my nobody's coming after me for heresy now, but I've decided that Bullinger's Eucharistic doctrine is more akin to mine than Calvin's himself, which I taught for 50 years. I think if you looking up that the sacramental debates, I've decided that the term substance coming directly out of Aristotle is taking us in the wrong direction. That would be an interesting debate between even the Protestants on what that actually means and whether or not it's necessary, especially given Kant and so on. But that would be an intramural discussion. The big discussion is the use of reason in human behavior, and especially in the spiritual dimension. What is it that we are selling or giving or heralding, however you want to put it? It's not reason. The Puritans were just flat wrong on that. And psychologists have demonstrated that reason is a fallible tool and that it is corrigible, and that somehow or other we learn what we want to learn, what we are predisposed to learn at some level. So anyway, it's still fun to think about, even if I can't come up with any kind of solution. Leave it to the younger generation, of course.
Yeah. Well, I half wonder whether that's why there's the success of churches in the West. The churches that tend to be growing are the ones that give a full-orbed place to the role of experience in our reasoning, as it were. So the charismatic movement is certainly in the UK is the only one. There's a few exceptions, but most of the churches that tend to be doing well among younger people are these ones that tap into the experiential factor. The big question in the back of my mind is the degree to which that's just Schleiermacher in a new guise, as it were, the feeling of absolute dependence. But is there a reference point beyond our subjective experience of God? The jury's out for me on that. But generally, of course, when I see the church growing, anywhere, I think it's a wonderful thing. But I do wonder sometimes whether that sort of Kantian critique picked up and spotted so ably by Barth after Schleiermacher, whether some of that could be leveled at the churches, even at the churches that seem to be doing well right now in the West and in South America, Africa, all of these places where it's growing now. But Charles, thank you so much for your time. I'm incredibly grateful to you for coming on to the podcast, and I've benefited enormously from your scholarship, and would encourage any of our listeners to check out his books, particularly the ones we were talking about. The Theology of John Calvin is a must read, and it's the best book on Calvin's theology I've come across in the last year. It's just so helpful, so clarifying and nuanced. And also Calvin and Classical Philosophy, which I'm still yet to get across, but I'm looking forward to it. And thank you so much for your time.
I'm very proud of my book on Africa. My father-in-law was murdered in the boundaries of Ethiopia and Somalia.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, this has been a long time ago. And we at one point were considering making a commercial movie, but they wanted $50 million to film part of it in Africa. But it was an interesting phenomenon to try to write something that's not footnotes. The footnotes are put as endnotes, because the editor said, if I put footnotes, I'll have to sell it as an academic book. So there's one footnote and the rest 30 footnotes in the back. But you might be interested in seeing what other interests can be done in another part of the world.
Yes. Well, what's it called?
It's called Adventure in Africa. And the subtitle is The Story of Don McClure.
Well, there you go. To anyone listening to this, that also sounds like another interesting rabbit hole to go down. I'm just thinking, what was he... I'm sorry to hear that he passed as well. What was he doing when he was out there? Was he a missionary or was he working?
Yes, he was a missionary. He went out to Sudan in 1928 and was there until his death. And he wrote a letter home every week with a little typewriter, sent it down the Nile or up the Nile. The Nile flows in a different way from most places. And I got those letters and put them together and made a story. And I was going to write a book on East Africa missions, but this was not an academic book. This was a personal book of a missionary who was trying to do medical work, agricultural work, educational work. Got the tribe he worked with was about 60,000, which is a pretty good sized congregation. And it had about a 3,000 word vocabulary, no word for love. They had no need to express that term and so on. So it was a 10-year occupation that I found really interesting. Most of us are more complicated than we ever present. Have interest and so on. I thought I was going to be a Major League Baseball player. I didn't know I was going to do academics with my life. So it's great to chat with you, of course.
Wow, Major League Baseball to Calvin scholar. So different, but so rich and interesting. And it's been such a privilege to talk with you. I really appreciate your time. And no doubt this will have been a real help for our listeners as well. And they can check out that book on Africa as well. I'm presuming that's available online, is it, if people look it up?
Yes, it costs 99 cents now.
Great.
On Kindle, but there are copies around still of hardcover and paper cover.
And what did he make of Calvin? Did you ever have a chance to ask him?
My father-in-law?
Yes.
No. No, he was one of the generous conservative folk. And he had lots of room for people who come down somewhere where I do, that the Christian faith begins and ends with the confession Jesus Christ is Lord. And as part of that lordship is our union with him. Finally, at the end of my life, that's what I think is non-negotiable. We can talk about predestination. We can talk about reason. We can talk about sanctification. By the way, I think it's very clear that Calvin believes in irresistible sanctification.
Say more about that. Irresistible sanctification. That's a new one.
Yeah, well, I was trying to think of a way to send you a copy. One of my friends in South Africa had a festschrift, and I decided I would try an essay on sanctification, just sanctification, and what I had in the book that sanctification Calvin deals with before justification. I make a lot of noise about the fact that reversal occurs in the Institutes. And so I look directly at sanctification. And I think Calvin, I'd have to look, it's been 10 years or so, but I think Calvin claims that sanctification is irresistible, as is grace, as is justification. And that seems to me another of those places where you don't want to approach that concept rationally. You want to recognize that there is somehow in the dynamic between these two terms, twin graces, he calls them, but you're looking at one of them and they're both irresistible. So in one way, they're different, quite different, and in a way, they're the same. I think that's a very fine thing. There's a German work on that same subject, but I don't think they've made the connection with irresistible. I'll send you a copy on irresistible sanctification.
Yeah, I'd absolutely love that. It sounds so interesting and very relevant to my research as well.
Sure. I'll do it.
Yeah, thank you.
Send me your mailing address and I'll send you a copy.
Thank you so much, Charles. That's really kind.
Till next time.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support.